The origin stories of many ancient cultures passed down throughout history state that, in the distant past, there were pockets of survivors who had emerged from hiding after a cataclysm, and their ancestors migrated for a long time, searching for livable lands. When they had first emerged, they saw complete and utter destruction of the landscape, nothing like it had been before the catastrophe. In some regions, there was a lot of debris and deposited matter, which buried the things that had been there. Hence the existence of deep buried structures and artifacts. The most important thing to keep in mind about the world immediately following the Great Flood is that there would have been extremely few resources to go around since everything was destroyed. Natural vegetation, wildlife, crops, and livestock all would have been decimated. There would have been scant amounts of edible materials, such as seeds, which would have been the last to settle after the flood due to their low density. And there would have been some animals that had survived, such as fish, amphibians, and insects, which other survivors could have turned to as a source of food in the aftermath of the cataclysm. So there would have been very little food to go around, and many of these people may not have been used to searching for food themselves, and so they would have had great difficulty surviving in the post-cataclysmic world. Among the life forms that did survive the cataclysm itself, only a few were able to withstand the gauntlet that faced them after the initial surge of destruction. It's easy to understand what survival after the cataclysm would look like if you reference more recent historical events, where people have had to survive famines, and situations in general where there was very little food and other resources to go around, such as the Donner Party incident, and famines like the Great Chinese Famine, the starving time at Jamestown, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 in Europe, and the North Korean famine of 1995 to 1999, which, in fact, was caused by widespread flooding. There's one thing that tends to almost unanimously occur during severe food shortages: cannibalism. During the Great Chinese Famine, people fought over corpses to eat, and they ate their own children, and other people's kids that they traded for. And they tried to eat other things too, like soil and tree bark, and they ate their own pets. And during the starving time in Jamestown, people ate rats, horses, dogs, and there's archaeological evidence that people were attacked so that they could be eaten by others. The Pilgrims who had settled in Plymouth County in the early 1600s had also found themselves in a virgin and undeveloped environment with harsh weather, and they had to figure out how to survive with very little resources, not knowing how to grow the crops native to the area, or how to fish and hunt effectively. The Wampanoag saw how much they were struggling, and taught them how to fish, and how to fertilize the soil using the fish, so that they could grow corn, beans, and squash, which were hardier plants. And they also taught them their methods of preserving food for the winter. Without proper knowledge of how to acquire and maintain resources, people and animals tend to become opportunistic predators, so it's good that the Wampanoag intervened when they did, because they probably anticipated what would happen if they left the Pilgrims to starve during the winter. The Wampanoag probably didn't want the Pilgrims to raid their food supply, and then eat their women and children next. Attempting to survive in the post-flood world would have been no easy feat. For food, the survivors could have searched for fish in isolated pools of water, animals and insects that had burrowed themselves in dirt, or possibly new plant life that had started to grow after the flood. Much of the water that was left over would have been contaminated with pathogens and debris, but all that would need to be done to make it drinkable is straining the water with a cloth and boiling it. But even that may or may not have been possible based on the resources available, like if there was any dry wood around to start a fire. And that's even if the survivors knew how to purify water or how to start a fire. But if some of the survivors were used to drinking unpurified water before the flood, they might have been more capable of drinking somewhat unclean water. Like how animals can drink out of ponds without it being purified, because they've built up stronger immune systems. What would have been nice about the situation of some of the survivors who had hidden in mountain caves to escape the flood is that mountains are functionally natural water towers that collect precipitation and slowly release it as freshwater streams that flow to the bottom of the mountain, which would have provided fresh water to the survivors, so they wouldn't need to worry about drinking from stagnant, contaminated sources or collecting rain, and having direct access to the fresh rainwater that would be collected by a mountain is just one of the many reasons as to why it was necessary for Noah's Ark to land near a mountain. And there are other reasons as to why it was crucial for Noah and his family and the animals that they brought with them to settle on Mount Ararat specifically, rather than one of the other mountains across the world that are taller than Mount Ararat and would have been exposed and available to land on before Noah's Ark settled on Mount Ararat. And according to geologists, the time span of the earliest eruptions of Mount Ararat coincide with the time frame when the Great Flood occurred, which according to scripture, the Great Flood had begun in the year 2348 BC. Which means that it's very unlikely for pre-flood people or creatures to have fled to the caves in this region to use them as shelters from the catastrophe, because these caves were still in the process of forming at the time that the Great Flood occurred. And this means that any other potentially hostile survivors would not have been hiding in the caves in this region, making the mountain a safe haven for Noah and his family and the animals that they had with them. And they had ample resources with them, and they had shelter, at the same time that other survivors across the world were stranded without resources and were attacking and eating each other in order to live. Noah had prepared the ark with enough food to sustain the animals he brought with him during and for a long time after the Great Flood, and this was important because it would be quite a while before any crops that Noah and his family had planted after the flood would be harvestable. Noah was instructed to take 7 pairs of each kind of clean animal and 1 pair of each type of unclean animal onto the ark with him, which implies that Noah and his family would have been able to eat 6 out of the 7 pairs of each kind of clean animal that was taken on board the ark, which would have left 1 pair of each kind of clean and unclean animal to repopulate the world after the flood. The food that was brought onto the ark was for the animals to eat, and the extra 6 pairs of animals were for the humans and carnivorous animals to eat. And eating more of the spare animals would actually help to prolong how much food was available in general, at least until the crops that were planted after the flood were ready to be harvested. While the population of survivors outside of Noah's safe haven had decreased due to them starving and eating each other, the population of the humans and animals with Noah increased, and as Noah's animals and family reproduced and built up their own numbers after the flood, they had to migrate south away from the mountains and towards the Fertile Crescent so that they would have more land available for farming and building structures. It was also getting much colder due to the onset of the Ice Age after the Great Flood, which would have made it necessary to migrate south in order to survive. And by that point, more of the vegetation had regrown, so the animals had more plant life to consume as they migrated. Of the surviving megafauna, many species had gone extinct during the Ice Age, which was caused by the Great Flood. In addition to the environmental shifts and lack of resources that contributed to their extinction, or forced them to speciate, they were one of the few substantial sources of food for other survivors. And this applied not just to animals, but also people, who were also consumed as a food source by survivors. And this would have been a primary reason as to why a lot of the populations who had re-emerged from underground were not able to survive in the world after the Great Flood. They would have attacked each other or starved before they were able to reproduce and repopulate. And even if they were able to reproduce, they often were not able to feed their own children, assuming that they wanted to feed their children instead of using them to feed themselves. And any survivors would have gone after the women and children first, since they were the smallest and the weakest, and therefore the easiest prey. Hiding from others would have been the best bet for many during this time. To those attempting to survive in the post-cataclysmic worlds, all would be considered fair game. The strongest and the smartest were able to prey upon the weaker survivors. And there was also a wide variety of survivors, some stronger, more ruthless, and more desperate to sustain themselves than others. There's a reason why cannibalism was so common amongst the various groups who were said to have emerged from caves in the ancient past. During famines, there's a significant difference between the reactions of people who are used to hunting and foraging for food themselves versus the people who are acclimated to a sedentary, agrarian lifestyle where they never have to search for food themselves. People in agrarian societies are much more prone to panicking and stealing food from others, and even eating other people because they don't have the knowledge or experience to source their own food in nature. The people who were in the Donner Party, for example, were businessmen, furniture makers, and farmers, but not hunters or foragers, so they didn't know how to effectively source food in nature. If the people in the Donner Party had searched around the area that they were stranded in, they could have found enough animals to eat instead of eating each other. There are many animals that survive in the winter in Donner Pass, such as beavers, deer, mountain lions, and coyotes. None of these animals hibernate during the winter, and there were actually some people in the Donner Party who had chosen to leave in search of a settlement or anyone who could help them, instead of staying and resorting to cannibalism. And several of these people actually reached settlements where they were given shelter and food. The same thing happened during the Andes Mountain incident in 1972. The survivors there began to eat each other as well. But 2 of the survivors decided to just leave to find help, and they were successful, which means that it was possible to just go somewhere else, instead of staying where they had no resources and resorting to cannibalism. Ancient cultures have actually documented where their ancestors had emerged from after the Great Flood, and where they ended up migrating to in search of better resources, so that they could settle and repopulate. The Mizo people in India said that after their ancestors had emerged from the deep caves of Qinlung after the ancient disaster of darkness, they had migrated through the region of Tibet, and eventually they settled in modern-day Mizoram in India. And the Inca said that the Ayar brothers had to search around for fertile lands after they had emerged from the Pakaratumbo mountain after the flood. And the Toltec in Mesoamerica described a period of 104 years, where their ancestors had migrated to after a great flood, searching for suitable land to settle. And the Hopi in the Four Corners region said that after their ancestors had re-emerged from the underworld, they too migrated for a very long period of time. And this migration is symbolized by the spiral-shaped petroglyphs in the region. And the Navajo, too, claimed that their distant ancestors had migrated after they had survived a great flood. The Navajo Traditional Teachings channel on YouTube features a Navajo elder who had learned about the legends of his people handed down by his ancestors. An interesting point that he had made about the migration of the distant ancestors of the Navajo is that they had come far from the east, and when they had settled in the southwest, they found other groups of survivors that they called the Cliff Dwellers because they were hiding in the cliffs. And the Navajo learned why the other tribespeople were hiding in the cliffs. It was to escape another group that the Navajo came to call the Anasazi. The Anasazi were not the same as the Pueblo, as is often mistakenly claimed. The Anasazi were known for taking people from other tribes, and using them not only as slaves, but also as a source of food for themselves. The Anasazi had come from the south, and they were said to have worshipped the darkness, mocked human life, and the religion of the Pueblo, claiming to be greater than their gods, and forcing the Pueblo to worship them. And also, petroglyphs in the region that archaeologists believe depict the Anasazi generally depict figures that have 6 fingers and 6 toes, like the giants who were encountered in the Middle East after the Great Flood. Eventually, the victimized tribes turned on the Anasazi and wiped them out, which is very similar to the Paiute story of the cannibalistic Sitka giants, who had similarly attacked the Paiutes and the other tribes in the region, until the tribes chased the giants into a cave and asphyxiated them with smoke. In many areas, it took a lot longer for the survivors to re-emerge from their caves or the other shelters that they had hidden in to escape the flood. They could have even stayed in hiding for many generations, and possibly speciated during the process. There were exits that were either submerged or in depositional zones, where massive amounts of sediment were deposited over the entrances of caves and structures, which would have trapped anyone inside. Over the past several thousand years, there have been many massive earthquakes across various regions, and in many cases, soon after these earthquakes, there were sightings of strange creatures, which could have been creatures that were trapped underground and unable to leave for many hundreds, if not thousands of years, after their exits had been sealed by layers of sediment after the Great Flood. And as for the other survivors of the Cataclysm, who had emerged from caves in other regions across the world, they sought out any other structures around for shelter. Like how in post-apocalyptic fiction, the survivors seek out and gravitate around old-world structures, to use them as shelters, and more importantly, to search for supplies. And in the cases where the survivors of the Great Flood were not able to find pre-flood structures that they were able to take refuge in, since so many structures were buried and demolished, the survivors of the Cataclysm had to build their own structures for protection. There are many structures that could have been built relatively soon after the catastrophe, that could have been used to protect the survivors from being attacked, and to shield them from the cold, which became an issue after the flood. It's not really possible to tell how long after the Cataclysm some structures were built. They would have been much more rudimentary than pre-flood structures, because they would have been built for shelter and not aesthetics. And most of the survivors didn't have access to advanced technology or the resources necessary to build elaborate structures. After the catastrophe, it appears that some of the survivors had built their own version of SOS signals. Geoglyphs. There are ancient geoglyphs scattered across the world, and they've been dated to be thousands of years old. But they're not pre-cataclysmic structures. They wouldn't have been able to withstand a great flood without being destroyed. The Bedouins said that the desert kite geoglyphs in the Arabian Peninsula were signs left by the early people in that region. Some of the geoglyphs across the world depict humanoids, and there are other geoglyphs that depict a variety of animals, such as the Ural moose geoglyph, the effigy mounds in North America, which originally would have been easier to see before they were overgrown. And some of the Nazca lines in Peru even depict animals that were supposedly not around when the geoglyphs were built, but the survivors of the Great Flood would have seen these animals before the cataclysm had wiped them out. It's been pointed out that a lot of these geoglyphs resemble runways, and some of them are also very similar in appearance to satellite calibration markers. A common theory about the geoglyphs is that they were made to ask for rain, which is kind of humorous, since they were actually made by survivors of the Great Flood. And there are caves in the same region as the Nazca lines, and these caves could have been used as shelters during the cataclysm. And when the people in this area had re-emerged from hiding after the cataclysm, there was not much available in terms of resources for long distances going in every direction. So their only real option, before they all perished due to a lack of resources, was to try to contact others who might have resources. There are many legends of post-flood survivors being met by their gods and receiving assistance after the flood. It's possible that these gods were other survivors who still had access to functional pre-flood technology and supplies. In ancient pre-flood Sumerian texts, like Enki in the World Order, the Anunnaki were described as rulers of the surface, and they lived in a city called Eridu. But later, in post-flood Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian texts, it's revealed that 300 Anunnaki were sent to the heavens, and another 300 were sent to the underworld, which would have kept them safe from the Great Flood. Neo-Assyrian texts from the 8th century BC also reveal that some of the Anunnaki had fled into the Eshemesha temple in order to survive a massive flood. The fact that the oldest pre-flood texts described the Anunnaki as rulers of the surface. But after the Great Flood happened, the later Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian texts state that the Anunnaki had to be relocated, shows that a major event had actually occurred that prompted this change. But after the flood, many of the Anunnaki who had fled to the heavens returned back to Earth and were extremely distraught about the destruction, and they had established many post-flood kingdoms, including Babylon, where they retaught humans how to cultivate plants and rebuild structures. And in ancient Thai mythology, after the Great Flood destroyed most due to their wickedness, there were two deities called Kun Luang and Kun Lai, who were said to have been sent from heaven, and they helped some of the other surviving humans on Earth migrate to a new land that they called Muang Thai. And these deities who had come down from the heavens taught the humans how to cultivate rice, farm, and build structures, much like the Anunnaki were said to have done in the Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian texts. And there are many other examples of so-called gods returning from the heavens to assist the survivors of the flood. But without help, many of the unprepared survivors would have perished. In most regions of the world after the cataclysm, the resources left over would be very scarce, and many of the survivors would have turned on each other, instead of working together to live. Only the hardiest, and the most prepared, would have been able to survive and repopulate the post-cataclysmic world. Thank you to those who have recently supported Shattered History: Doc Benson, M.R., Scooby Clark, John R. Amun, M. Bugatan, A.L.V., Liam Flatley, Mama Lou, Bree0013, and Craig B. 6611. It's a good thing that we made it back to our cave before any of those things got us.
But Mommy, I'm hungry.
Oh, shut up. Just go eat your brother.